This is Robert Scheer with another edition of Sheer Intelligence, where the intelligence goes to my guest. And Javier Zamora, who is probably well known to many listeners of NPR station like KCRW, has, just risen to be one of America's major poets, writers. And the book that he wrote, it's so compelling that we're here to discuss Solito, a memoir, Penguin Random House. And we're on election day when we're doing this. And the issue of immigration floats around there in the, like a, I don't know, flow. It's more like a cancer moves through our body politic and all the lying about it, often quite bipartisan. And if there's one thing you should ever look at, read, or anything, if you ever want to talk in a meaningful way about immigration as a human concern, it's this book. And I have covered this issue as a journalist in my 29 years at the LA Times. I've been on the border. I've interviewed people about it. I've written about it. But until I read this book, I just didn't even know what I was talking about. It's a story of a 9-year-old spent 7 weeks trying to get to the United States to see his mother and father. I'm going to let Javier talk about the writing of it, but I do want to start with one character, your grandfather. And even though I'm a gringo, I do take my 9-year-old to school, like your grandfather took you. My 9-year-old grandson, who's also has connection with Latin America, Mexico, and most of the kids in his school do. And at first, I was alienated by your writing because the grandfather is this smelly old person, which I guess I am also to a 9-year-old. And then he emerges as a really a considerate and incredible figure. So just take us to the beginning of the story and this incredible book. And I wanted to begin by actually the tribute at the very end. Maybe you could get to it. Who you dedicate the book to all of the immigrants, and you bring it back, to the political problem. And after all, you're coming from a country that the U.S. messed up, presumed that the conceit that we could control their politics. Then you go through Guatemala, from El Salvador, another country that the U.S. was involved in a coup, and then you go through Mexico. You finally get to the idyllic world of San Rafael, Marin County, California, where you've been, and then you go off to NYU to college. So just take it. It's your book, and it's incredible. And fortunately, it's one of those things that I really respect enormously, and I don't even have to help sell it. It's a great success, so you don't even need my pushing it.
Well, thank you, Robert. It's an honor to be here, and I'm glad to hear that you walk your 9-year-old grandson to school as well. And I'll begin by recapping the book. So there was a civil war that happened in El Salvador from 1980 to 1992. I was born in 1990. My dad leaves in 1991 when I'm still 1 years old. My mom leaves in 1995 when I am 5, and she leaves me with my grandma, my aunts, and my grandpa. And by the time that I'm 9 years old, my parents have tried to bring me here in multiple ways, but none of them have worked. And so, in their logic, that they're gonna use the same coyote or smuggler to bring me here, the same one that my mom used in 1995. And her trip was relatively fast and safe. She made it here in 14 days, and the coyote was with her every single step of the way. And so they were expecting the same treatment for me. And of course, that did not happen. And at the beginning of the trip, my grandpa accompanied me because he wanted to make sure that everything was going to plan. And for the first 2 weeks, he comes and stays with me in Guatemala at the Mexico Guatemala border. And it is during those 2 weeks that it seems that I get to meet my grandpa for the first time, because for the first 9 years and the first 5 years of my life, he was not the best character around, and I was afraid of him. But during these 2 weeks, he tells me a lot about his life, and he gives me a lot of the wisdom. For example, reminds me of this character, Acadejo, which is like this mythical figure in Salvadoran folklore. And he tells me that I get one, and that mythical figure is gonna protect me. And I believe him, and I pray to this mythical figure for the rest of the 9 weeks. Um, so yeah, I'll I'll leave it at that for now.
Well, let's talk about him a little bit. I mean, the book is so rich, and and the writing it's incredible. I mean, and you know, you were a pretty smart 9-year-old, although you were not toilet trained, and you couldn't tie your own shoelaces, and you know had the marks of a rural life, I guess, and economically more deprived one. Uh, but you clearly were, you know, you were a very sharp student. You were even doing in this perilous journey of 7 weeks in the spring of 1999, which makes you, I guess, about 30 something now, right? 30,
32.
yeah, 32. You know, you still were doing your homework at the beginning under your grandfather's supervision, which is one of the things I'm reflected in my grandson. I'm sure he objects to my constantly pushing that. Probably not as much as his mother would like, but you know, your grandfather was represented the complexity of this history. Who are these people? The other, the immigrants, and so forth. And at the end, you say he does end up coming to the United States, right? But he was in the military or police, right?
Yeah.
And he was actually protected the president, and he was there in that village, you know, as part of remembering the politics and the madness, and that runs through your book. That you're on the side of the most vulnerable. You're how can you be more vulnerable crossing a border by yourself when you're 9? You don't really by yourself. You get support from this group, including the coyotes. But you know, it's the fact is this: we have refugees and we have migration because people have suffered, and part of that suffering has been visited upon them by the powerful countries, the rich countries, and certainly El Salvador is a very good example. And you know, so like, give us that background. I mean, your family is thrown up in the air and then descends and manages to get back together again, but it's not because of their own capriciousness or their ambition or their desire for the bright lights of L.A. or something. Right? They're actually victims of a history that is visited upon them by powerful people, including the nation that they try to get to for a different measure of safety.
Well, you know, uh, as an undergrad, I majored in history. And I think I needed to major in history in order to understand this question of why am I here? Why is my family here? And through history, I learned a lot of facts. For example, El Salvador during the war was a nation of 5 million people. After the war, close to 500,000 flee. Most of them come to the United States. In 2022, we're a nation of 6 million people. 1.5 to 2 million plus now live in the United States. And before the war, there were less than 70,000 Salvadorans that lived in the United States. And so, you know, there are a lot of facts that get thrown around by politicians, by journalists, and the facts don't seem to land well. They don't seem to make a difference. And so I guess I was pushed towards writing my family's truth, because another fact that stuck with me is that out of all the Salvadorans that fled during the war, less than 2% of them were granted refugee status. We were all refugees of the war, but because of Reagan politics and because of the Cold War, if you were fleeing a democracy, quote unquote, a democracy that the United States was financially supporting at one time more than any other country in the world, more than Israel at one point. My country was getting more than $1.8 million a day. That's taxpayers' money. And when the U.S. was so invested in my country, you couldn't say that people that were fleeing a democracy were refugees. And so more than 98% of Salvadorans don't have papers or were deemed undocumented since the moment they entered this country. And so this is the backdrop of where my grandpa comes in. My family is not unusual in El Salvador. I had members of both my dad's and my mom's side of the family that half of them were in the right and a lot of them were in the left. My dad was a leftist in a family. He's the last of 17 siblings. 3 of them were leftists and the rest of them were right wing. And he has a brother that was also security for the president, like my grandpa was in the 80s, in the 70s. And so my grandpa was and still is very right wing. And, he's a complicated figure. And he's a complicated figure that I think learned to drink what he witnessed and his emotions away. But because he loved his daughters, and my mom, before she fled the country, she made him promise that he was never going to drink again because she was afraid to leave me, her only child, her only son, with him. And so he did. He hasn't drank since he made that promise. And so he's like most human beings, like I will go as far as say all human beings, the characters are in my book are very complicated. And a lot of those characters are also the immigrants that I came here with, which I call the six. We set out with 8 people, the coyote and this other woman named Marta being 2 of them, plus 6 others. There was Chele, who was a 32-year-old man. There was Marcelo, who couldn't have been older than 29. Chino, who was probably 19 years old. Marta, who was this beautiful woman who was probably 28. Patricia, a mom who she was probably like 27 with her 12-year-old daughter Carla, and myself. And these is the group that sets out, and slowly we become the 6, and then we become the 4. And the 4 is this group who I dedicate the book to, which is Chino, Patricia, Carla, and myself. And they are the core group that actually ends up taking care of me, and they are the reason why I survived.
You use this word that they're complex figures, and of course, chauvinism, stigmatization, it all is based on denying the complexity of the other.
Mm-hmm.
And the incredible thing about your book is that not a single person in this book can be disregarded once you read the book. They all have, yes, their contradictions, their passions, their intelligence, their wisdom, both earned from experience and their own thoughtfulness or anger or whatever. And you end the book. I never found out what happened to Chile or to any of the countless others who were with me. I fear they died in the Sonoran Desert. This book is for them and for every immigrant who has crossed, who has tried. Oh God, I'm crying. Do you have that in front of you? Can you read it? Who has tried to, who is crossing right now, and who will keep trying. And God, this has never happened to me on a podcast. But my own mother was an undocumented immigrant from Lithuania, left after the Russian Revolution. Her group was persecuted by the Bolsheviks as they had been by the Tsar. And so, and I've been on all sides of this. I've been on those INS, now ICE raids. I've been in the fields when people were arrested. I was on the border with a progressive guy in the Carter administration, Leonard Castillo, who was the immigration commissioner. But yet, when they're rounding these people up, they're like rounding up, and at the best sense, maybe sheep. that they might want to preserve, or foxes that they're going to kill. The dehumanization is baked into the whole immigration issue. And what your book, the reason it is the indispensable book to read about this subject is you categorically deny that vicious simplification and disregard for humans. You do what Christ, and I'm not a religious person, commands in a parable, at least, of the Good Samaritan,
Mm.
that you have to care about the other. And that we don't have almost none of that in our discussion of immigration. It's all politicized, it's all the humanity is taken out. And, I don't want to, yes, the book succeeds on many other levels. But for me, God, I just found it, indispensable really to understand what's at stake here. It's those people dying in the desert, and they are you,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. And I want to talk about silence as well, because since the moment that I crossed the finish line, meaning the US Mexico border, and I am reunited with my parents, and I chose to end the book there because that is just the beginning of a long story of silence. So from the ages of 9 up until I'm 29, when I began to write this book, I can't remember, or I don't want to remember this story, because if I do, I have to at the same time recognize that a lot of these characters, a lot of these people, I don't know what happened to them. And that passage that you just read is true. I fear that these people died, like many others have died, countless others that don't even make the figures of, Border Patrol just started um, counting numbers of people dying at the desert in 1999. We don't know how many others died before and continue to do so. And I think it's that life toll, that realization that somehow I survived and I am not one of those figures, is what caused my silence, and also what causes silence in immigrant communities. We don't want to remember this. It is hard to remember this. This meaning our own, because not two stories are the same, but we don't want to recount these stories that we keep hidden. And sometimes we keep them hidden because of us, of our own brains, because that's what our brains tell us in order to survive, but also because of these politicians and because of these journalists. Because every time that a politician tells us that crossing the border is a crime, we internalize that. And for 20 years, I have felt that I did something wrong, when in reality, we are all complex human beings, and sometimes we are forced to do something that doesn't make sense, but that doesn't make it wrong. And that doesn't make me wrong. And I hope that this book, what you were saying, that it complicates the issue, and it really makes us immigrants into actual human beings, not these flat caricatures that politicians spew out of their mouths, and sometimes the journalists also write us into. The meaning, but what I mean by that is that they flatten us into our trauma, only our trauma, when we are not only our traumas. I am not these 9 weeks. I am far more than these 9 weeks that I describe, and I allow readers to embody and put my shoes, for them to walk in my shoes, so to speak. And yeah.
You know, yeah, I mean, what is actually what's so great about your book is it's a tribute to literature, and it's what journalism lacks, and it's not the fault. I'm a journalist; it's what I've done all my life, and that's the job, and it's an important job.
Hmm.
But you're a poet, you're a writer, basically, and and what's so compelling, and I say it's the rare occasion for me where something I want to celebrate is also celebrated by the larger society. I mean, this book is a big hit, but if you want publishing language, it's accessible to people. People are inspired by it. And we might talk a little bit about your journey. I mean, you were in a very privileged community where you end up there in San Rafael, but you run into some teachers, one of whom ends up being what, the poet laureate of the United States, and they inspire you and people along the way. What you say is complexity is really the significance of being human.
Yeah.
That's what it's interesting that you don't want to talk about it because late in life, my mother lived to actually be close to the age I am now, and we had two bronze candlestick holders in the house, and I never could figure out why she wanted to hold on to them. They were kind of
Mm.
ugly and heavy, and so forth. One was owned by her sister, my aunt, who came across with her in steerage and on a perilous journey. Uh, I'm sure it had characteristics similar to yours. They were older, they were young women, and they're 20-year-old, and so forth. And only late at the end did she tell me the candlestick holder she used as her defense mechanism to protect her, from other immigrants, from people who wanted to abuse her, and so forth.
Mm.
And, the idea, and yet she never talked about it. She was always put, the best face on being an immigrant garment worker in New York and so forth. It's great. I get to stand in line at the concert. I get to have a son who goes to college, all that kind of stuff. And what I found compelling about it, what is it, 7 weeks? It's 7 weeks showing of, and it's important that it's a variety of human beings. Even the guards in Mexico that want to get money, the police. There's some contradictions, some doubt. The coyotes. They're not just exploiting; they're aiding. Why don't you talk about that a bit? Heroes. They like your grandfather. You're scared of him, and then he turns out to be a source of wisdom. I'm not pushing grandfathers because I'm one here, but I'm just saying this is really what literature's all about, and that journalism isn't,
Mm.
and
Well,
politics isn't.
yeah. Um, well, and I want to remind listeners and readers that I am describing a network that existed in 1999. I volunteer at the border now, and the players have changed. In 1999, the cartels weren't in the business of smuggling people. Now they very much are. And so, if you stay with me, 1999, some of these smugglers genuinely, and I also want to extend and actually say that they do and they did help make people's lives better. You know, their job was created because of a demand, and that demand was that people were fleeing places that weren't safe, and so these people, coyotes, smugglers, were helping people. And in my case, that certainly did occur. Not all the time. Not with our initial person, Don Dago, which is the coyote's name from El Salvador, because he left us. So there's that type of coyote. But there's also, the coyotes that eventually do take us and help us along the way. And so that's just an example of how, you know, I guess to put it back into um, capitalistic terms. If there's a demand, there's going to be a person that's going to do that job, and there are going to be people that love that job and are going to do the very best that they can and there are others that are not. And that's certainly the same thing with Coyote in 1999. And, you know, I also want to talk about privilege. I have a green card now. I could never have imagined writing a book like this if I did not have papers. I also couldn't have written a book like this if I didn't have the privilege to have a therapist that genuinely held my hand as I walked or retraced my steps with her. And I wouldn't have done this if I didn't have such a supportive wife and partner that I do, who also, held my other hand and helped me retrace this journey, which from 2019, December of 2019, up until I finished editing the book in August of 2022 of this year, these people were alongside me. My job was to remember and retrace my steps, which is a huge privilege that the average immigrant who has suffered maybe not as much or maybe 10 times more than I suffered during those 9 weeks, they don't have the privilege to do so.
Well, I want to thank you for that summary. And before I let you go, though, uh, okay, the book ends with you don't even know if you're going to see your parents. You think they're there, the other side of the door, and then we know that you end up, from what's written about you, and what is a privileged section of Marin County, California, Northern California, one of the richest in the country. But I assume your family was living in more difficult circumstance even there, but it must have been a world apart from where you grew up in Salvador. So take us there, and how does it end? And what do? You become the normal suburban American kid, or what?
Well, we hardly. I guess technically it is suburbia, but I just remember, 24 hours after I crossed the desert, I'm reunited with my parents, and then we drive across. We land at SFO. We drive across the Golden Gate Bridge, and Marin County is beautiful, and it is one of the richest counties in the world at the time. I think it was number 7. It's still top 10, and but as we drive closer to what I thought was my parents' home, there are less and less houses. There are these other things called apartment buildings. After apartment building, you know, uh, we turn into a neighborhood in San Rafael called La Canal, which I want to say is perhaps 95%, immigrant community, recent immigrant community, like I was that day. And we get to a door, and my parents still remind me of this. I said, okay, where is the house? And I just remember my dad almost crying because they're opening the door to an apartment complex. And I think that is a metaphor for my life in the United States. What I left in El Salvador, I left acres of land. I left like different oranges, different mango trees. As a child, that is a childhood that perhaps doesn't exist for many people in the world. Which if I wanted a fruit, I could just go to the back and take it from the tree and eat it. But then I get to Marin County being so close to the rich and yet not being rich. And then being in a 2-bedroom apartment that my parents rent out one of the bedrooms and then they rent out the living room. And I am stuck in this small bedroom that my parents sleep right next to me. My whole world is crunched. And it is that crunch that makes it so difficult for 9-year-old me, 10-year-old me, to really make sense of why I did what I did, meaning survive the 9 weeks that it took me to get here. And it is that question that I think it's the reason why I'm a writer today. I'm just trying to understand why. And how do refugees from the Salvadoran Civil War wind up in the richest county in the United States, and why their lives are not like those around them, meaning the citizens, the gringo citizens surrounding the canal in San Rafael. And I think that is the question that I am still trying to understand today. And I think that's going to be the main question of my next book, because from the ages of 9 up until 21, my entire time that I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area, I was undocumented. And it's not until I graduate UC Berkeley that I get this status called TPS. That's kind of like DACA, or what Dreamers have. And it's not until then that I leave the Bay Area. So to me, the Bay Area, Marin County, the canal specifically, it's a complicated place. And I think that it's also not an unusual relationship to have as an immigrant to wherever it is that you land, from your home countries to here.
Yeah, and you're also quite close to San Quentin
Yeah.
prison, with its infamous death row and a largely racialized population
Yeah.
of people that have suffered, many ways more than people in your home country, one of the
Mm-hmm.
largest prison populations. So it is, and yet there's a consciousness. There are people who mean well,
Uh-huh.
and let's end on a positive note. You do mention in your book that you had teachers there. One of whom goes on to become poet laureate of the United States, and then you've had this incredible success with this book, and it's deserved. But let's I don't know. We always forget, of course, we pay tribute to immigrants for having made America, which they clearly did. Okay, and then you're a good achievement of example of that. You still don't have the full the citizenship, but you've contributed enormously as a poet, and I was the writer of a memoir uh, to our life. So let's talk about it as a happy ending, at least so far.
Um, yes, I my life in this country is at times unbelievable, even to myself. But I would caution against using the term dream to refer to my life, because I don't want to sign up to something that doesn't necessarily happen for most people. And I am very aware that my quote unquote success hasn't and didn't happen and doesn't happen for many people. Most of the people that I in Bahia Vista Elementary School, I was not the smartest kid. And at Davidson Middle School, I was also not the smartest kid. But you know, we forget that luck has a lot to do with it. And I am very lucky. I have been very fortunate to be at the right place at the right time. For example, I got a full ride to go to the Branson School, which is one of the best quote unquote high schools in the country. And I only
Is
got
that
there.
The Catherine Branson School?
No, Marine Catholic is the Catholic one. The Branson schools where Julia Childs were, and
Oh, yeah,
and
but was it
Mobley.
the woman that it's named after, Catherine Branson? I think.
I
No,
think I
no.
don't. I don't know. I don't know.
Oh, okay.
Perhaps they don't teach us that way.
But it is one of the really elite schools in
Yeah,
California,
yeah.
private schools, no question about it.
And
So
that happened
yeah,
by luck. I coach saw me playing soccer, and it turns out that coach that coached me from sixth grade up until I'm 18, he happened to be the athletic director of the Branson School, and so he helped us with the application process, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's what I'm talking about. That you know, on paper, I have all the accolades. I have gone to X, Y, and Z university,
well,
and
tell us about that. You went, you no, no, because it's part of the American fantasy, and yet corruption in a way.
yes,
The singling out of certain people who are then useful and acceptable.
Yes.
okay. I mean, I'm not, I'll put myself in there.
Yeah.
I grew up in the Bronx with immigrants and so forth. But yeah, if you can make yourself useful to the system, or at least not be ultimately threatening, you get some chances. Who knows where your writing will go? Maybe they
Hmm.
won't like it.
Yeah.
That's also. But why don't you tell us a little bit about that? Because you ended at what, at Stanford, Harvard, all these places, and you
Yeah.
know.
I graduated from UC Berkeley. My last year, they started a scholarship for undocumented students, and I was one of the first undocumented students at UC Berkeley to get that scholarship. Because for undocumented students, we don't qualify for federal grants, for federal loans. So it was difficult to be a student at the time was the number one public university in the world. And from there, I go to NYU. When I go there, it is the richest university in the world, or the one that costs the most. And I get a full ride. And then I go to Stanford and Harvard. And at all these, what I do want to add, and again, complicating the narrative, that at all these places, I felt like an outsider. And because I usually was the only brown student or first generation student in a room, and very often I was the only previously undocumented student in a room. And I want to complicate this idea of a dream for me would be where I end saying, like, I don't have to say that I am the first of, blah, blah, blah. That carries its toll. And we also have in the United States this narrative of the good immigrant versus the bad immigrant, where it's more complicated than that. When I was at all these institutions, I was suffering, mentally speaking. My mental health was not the best. I did things that I shouldn't have done. And so that's what's also not talked about, the toll that these dreamers, these immigrants carry with them for being the first. And I am tired of being the first. I think that a lot of people are. And so that's what I want to say. And I hope that as a writer, I'm also complicating those portrayals or ideas that people throw onto my life and my CV.
I think that is. I'm happy that we had a break and we're doing this. I don't know if you know another writer, Obed Silva, in my class last night, and I did a podcast with him, and he's written a book about his own cross-border journey back and forth from Mexico, and then he was in a gang and he got shot, and he's now lives in where, but he's also teaching literature at Cal State here over in East LA, and he's written another book that is well received, very well received, and yet you mentioned luck, accident. Yeah, he survived it,
Mm-hmm.
but he did serve time in prison, and it was hard. And the system was rigged against him. And if he had taken the plea bargain, it would have been 12 years, and he would have been finished. And I think we could just that's the problem with success stories. It makes the failure of others their fault.
Mm-hmm.
And that's got to be challenged because the system
Absolutely.
is really rigged against us. And getting it's that scholarship you mentioned, but not everybody can get to use it, not everyone gets admitted, there isn't enough to go around. And I think the story, I live in Los Angeles, been here a long time, the story of most immigrants in this town who did not come from the selected WASP areas of the world. I remember when I was first covering this issue, the quotas were 25,000 from Mexico and 25,000 for Iceland. Well, Iceland had 300,000 people
Yeah.
and no great desire to come here. And so, in my own coverage of this issue, hypocrisy was the name of the game.
Yeah.
Take a country like Mexico, almost everybody in Mexico has as much acclaim to be in any other part of what's now called the United States as anyone else who arrived here, unless they're indigenous, and the indigenous people live on both sides of the border. So I think this is an important point because you are now in a position where you are being celebrated. I hope it lasts. You certainly deserve it. It's one of the most powerful books that I've ever read. I think it's incredible. I want to be clear about that. And you deserve any success, but you will be under pressure to be the poster immigrant. Why can't everybody be like that? And what you've just said is, you weren't like that. You're complex.
Yeah,
And one of the strengths of this book was your honesty, admitting, just the act of going to the bathroom or tying your shoes, and your own doubt of self, and yet the love that was shown for you by your relatives, by people who were strangers.
strangers. Yeah,
Yeah. I mean, I think it's the most compelling thing about this book because we tried, Donald Trump particularly, tried to make the people coming across the border as, just zombies and inhuman people and, opportunistic and so forth. This is a love story. I mean, yes, they're complex. Yes, they might smell bad at times when they're sweating, crammed into a van or something. Yes, people are worried about themselves. But this is really, I mean, is that a fair point on which to sum this up? That
yeah,
it is? Is it a
and
love story?
yeah, and they are all survivors. That is a term that I think rarely gets used when we speak about immigrants. Refugees sometimes, but I think we are all surviving something and running away from something. And maybe if we treat immigrants as survivors, maybe we who are no longer immigrating or who have never immigrated, we can have a bigger level of empathy for these people that are just human beings, being asked to survive the unsurvivable and the horrendous. And even in those horrendous scenes that I describe and scenes that continue to happen as me and you are speaking right now, these individuals show superhuman abilities to just embody empathy. I certainly wouldn't be alive if the individuals around me didn't show me the empathy that they did and the love that they did. And so I just hope that me writing this um, gives back that love, some of that love that they gave me when I was 9 years old.
Well, that is the spirit of the book. I want to, and by the way, sometimes people hesitate to pick up a book like this. Okay, how much suffering can you handle? But amazingly enough, because it is so human, it's a page turner. I just want to tell people that this is a book that you will believe it or not, enjoy reading.
Hmm. Thank you.
Because you will see yourself in it. Not just, because I happen to be from immigrants, well, of course, almost all, but the book is also about indigenous people and about race and about color and divide and conquer. And the book, okay, I'm going to go out on a limb here. It's brilliant. It's actually a brilliant exposition on the human condition, and you use the immigrant issue issue as a way of discussing what is this common humanity that we refer to every once in a while, and if it exists, it sure exists in your book. So let me end on that note of
Hmm.
endorsement, and thanks for
Thank you
doing
so
this.
much. Oh, yeah,
Well,
that's quite an endorsement. Thank you,
yeah, well,
Robert.
okay, it's spontaneous. So I got to stop gushing and get more professional here. I want to thank, by the way, some very fine people, Laura Kondajarian and Christopher Ho at KCRW, the terrific NPR station in Santa Monica, for getting these things posted, getting them out there. Joshua Scheer, our executive producer, who happens to be my son and the grandson of those immigrants on both sides of our family that came from he's the one that pushed me to do this and said, enough talking to old white guys. This is an incredible book. You got to get this guy on the show. So a special shout out to Joshua Scheer. And I want to thank the JKW Foundation in the memory of a terrific writer, Gene Stein, for putting up some funding for this. And I'm going to one more last one. Natasha Hakimi Zapata, who won the Poetry Award. Uh, she's from a Mexican and Persian background, won a major poetry award at UCLA many years ago, works with me on our website. And she's the one that was very familiar with your poetry. I think you came in even to speak in one of her classes. And so I do want to thank her for getting me to stay up all night to read the book, which was not difficult to do. Okay, and on that note, see everybody next week with another edition of Sheer Intelligence.
Hey.
Non, je ne regrette rien, ni le bien